Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk about what's going on in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about Russia's oil exports because on the surface, things might actually look quite positive for Russia right now. Global oil prices are rising as a result of what's going on in Iran and the wider Middle East area. And normally when oil prices rise, that's good news for oil producing countries such as Russia. Higher prices mean higher revenues. But in Russia's case, the reality is very different because despite rising oil prices, Russia is now facing a growing list of problems that are making it increasingly difficult to export its oil and generate the revenues that the Kremlin desperately needs. And there are three major issues happening at the same time from Russia's perspective. Firstly, Russia is being forced to sell its oil at massive discounts compared with global prices. Secondly, it's starting to encounter problems finding buyers, particularly as political pressure increases on key customers such as India. And third, Russia's oil export system is now under increasing pressure from drone strikes, infrastructure disruptions, and severe weather, all of which are limiting its ability to move oil to international markets. So today we're going to go through exactly what's happening and why even rising oil prices might not be enough to solve Russia's continuing growing energy problems. So let's start with the issue of pricing. Because one of the biggest challenges that Russia has faced since the invasion of Ukraine is that many traditional buyers stopped purchasing Russian oil altogether. Before the war, Europe was the biggest single customer for Russian energy, but sanctions and political pressure forced most European countries to dramatically reduce or completely eliminate their purchases of Russian crude. And that meant that Russia had to find new customers. And the two biggest buyers that stepped in were China and India. We've talked about that a lot on the channel. However, those countries are only willing to buy Russian oil at a significant discount, and those discounts remain substantial to date. In some recent trades, Russian oil has been selling for discounts of more than $30 per barrel compared with Brent crude in Asian markets. And to put that into context, Brent crude is around about $80 per barrel at the moment, and Russia is receiving less than $50 in its sales. So that is a huge difference. And the reason for these discounts is simple, because Russian oil now comes with a lot of additional risks. There are sanctions to navigate, particularly secondary sanctions, shipping restrictions, insurance complications, payment systems that have to avoid Western financial institutions, and the constant risk that new sanctions or political pressure could disrupt supply. So buyers demand a discount to compensate them for these risks. And that means that even when global oil prices rise, Russia does not receive the full benefit, far from it. But pricing is only part of the problem. The second major issue is that Russia is now facing increasing difficulty finding its buyers. Since 2022, India has become one of the most important customers for Russian crude. We've talked about this a lot on the channel. Indian refiners dramatically increased imports because discounted Russian oil created a major opportunity to improve their profit margins. If you're buying your raw material much cheaper and you're selling your end product for the same price, then obviously you make more profit. However, that relationship has started to change. Recent developments in global trade politics have raised the possibility that India could completely stop Russian oil purchases altogether. Talked about this recently, that India previously had a 50% tariff that was imposed by Donald Trump. It was then reduced to 18% as part of a negotiation under which India agreed to stop buying Russian oil. However, because the Supreme Court has now overruled all of that, we don't really know what's going to happen going forward, whether India will stick with that agreement not to buy it or whether they'll start buying again. However, if India doesn't buy any more Russian oil, it's going to be a major problem for Russia because there aren't any other alternative countries to go to. Now, China, from its perspective, has already been reducing its purchases of Russian oil, and most Western countries have already exited the market. So if India does completely stop buying Russian oil, it's going to be a major headache from Russia's point of view. And we talked about the fact before that if it sees a huge fall in its volumes, it may have to actually stop producing the oil, and that could have major implications for the Russian oil industry for the long term. So Russia's oil revenues are currently reducing as a result of buyers not wanting to purchase the oil. But the third major problem that Russia is facing is the physical ability to export oil in the first place. Ukraine has increasingly targeted Russia's energy infrastructure with drone strikes aimed at refineries, storage facilities, and export infrastructure. Several recent attacks have caused fires and operational disruptions at key facilities connected to Russia's oil export network. These strikes are part of a broader strategy by Ukraine to reduce the revenue Russia generates from oil exports, and they appear to be having an impact. For example, attacks on pumping stations and related infrastructure have disrupted flows through parts of Russia's export system. One of the most notable incidents has involved damage to the Druzhba pipeline, one of the main routes used to transport Russian oil into Central Europe. Some of the Central European countries are still buying. So this pipeline historically supplied countries such as Hungary and Slovakia, but recent disruptions mean that oil flows have been suspended for extended periods while repairs are carried out. And according to officials, those flows are not expected to start anytime soon. On top of the infrastructure attacks, Russia is also facing another problem: severe winter weather. Ice storms in the Baltic Sea have slowed operations at several of Russia's major export ports. These include key facilities used to ship crude oil to international markets. Tanker movements have been delayed, loading operations have slowed, and that reduces the volume of oil leaving Russia. So when you combine weather disruptions with drone strikes and infrastructure damage, Russia's export system has become much more fragile. And this brings us onto the key issue. Russia's oil revenue depends on two things: the price it receives for its oil and the volume of oil it can export. Right now, both of those factors are under pressure. Russia is receiving lower prices because of discounts, and it's facing growing difficulties exporting its oil. So even if global oil prices increase, the benefit for Russia may be smaller than people expect. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, Russia's oil sector is now facing pressure from multiple directions at the same time. Political pressure from sanctions, market pressure from buyers demanding discounts, and physical pressure from infrastructure attacks and export disruptions. And any one of those challenges could be manageable in itself, but all three happening simultaneously creates a far more difficult situation. And this matters because oil revenue is the backbone of the Russian economy. Energy exports fund a huge portion of Russia's government budget, including the war in Ukraine. They help support the currency, and they play a critical role in financing government spending. But Russia's economy is already facing increasing strain. Inflation remains elevated, government spending has surged, and the budget deficit has been widening. So if Russia begins to earn less from oil exports at the same time that spending continues to rise, that creates a much more difficult economic environment. And that means the problems we're now seeing in the Russian oil sector could have much wider consequences for the Russian economy as a whole. Because if the country that relies so heavily on energy exports starts struggling to sell that energy profitably, then the economic pressures on the Kremlin are only going to increase. And that's why the developments we are seeing right now in Russia's oil export system could become a much bigger story over the next few months, even if the conflict in Iran does continue and if oil prices continue rising. It doesn't mean that Russia is going to benefit significantly, and this is the get out of jail card that Russia have been hoping for to save their economy in 2026. As we've talked about many times before, the deficit is widening, Russia's revenues are contracting, and this is a major problem because Russia is funding the deficit using its national wealth fund. That's now severely depleted. It's now having to sell gold and raise debt, and they will have long-term implications for the Russian economy because it is weakening the fundamental structure that Russia has been built upon. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. If you'd like to get involved in that and help to fund the channel, then please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.